Okay, I think we can get started. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lorenzo Vidino. I'm the director of the program on extremism. I'm delighted to welcome everybody to today's event, which is on a topic that is quite dear to me on a personal level, as somebody who has spent the last 20 years looking at Islamism in the West. And indeed, today we have the pleasure of discussing, along with three great speakers, the gap that exists currently between Europe and America when it comes to Islamism. We're not speaking about terrorism. We're not speaking about jihadism. Topics on which, for the most part, we see similar views when it comes to the threat on both sides of the Atlantic. But if we speak about political Islam, particularly, and this is what we will discuss today, the impact of Islamist ideology as represented by political or quietist currents of the Salafist movement or groups like the Muslim Brotherhood domestically. So not in the Middle East, but within Western societies. I think it's fair to say that the transatlantic gap has never been wider in the 20 years since the issue has become widely debated among policymakers and in the public. Let me briefly summarize, inevitably oversimplifying what I mean. I think it's fair to say that on one hand, Europeans are increasingly discussing the impact of Islamist groups on their society. Such concerns are not new among Europeans, but it's noteworthy that today the debate is much more mainstream than in the past. And concerns about non-violent Islamists are expressed by politicians and commentators of all political persuasions. Now, of course, dynamics change from country to country. It's been very intense lately when it comes to France and Austria, less in other European countries. But I think it's fair to say that throughout Europe, it's a mainstream conversation. It transcends the traditional left-right divides, and it's relatively nuanced. The emphasis is obviously on relatively here, but I would say it's probably more nuanced compared to a few years ago. Now, these developments are in stark contrast with the situation in the United States. Now, Americans pay significant attention to the Islamic State, to Al-Qaeda, and to jihadism in general, but they seldom focus on the many non-violent manifestations of Islamism. When they do so, they mostly look at the issue through the lens of US foreign policy, concentrating on how to deal with Islamist movements in Muslim-majority countries. And also, I would say, for the most part, Americans do not really understand the European debate and the Europeans' concerns about Islamism. And I think this has become painfully evident during the last few weeks when the US political establishment responded with apathy to the developments in France, and large parts of the US media covered the actions and language of Macron and the European debate in general with very strong criticism, even leading the French president to issue public rebuttals. Now, I significantly oversimplified very complex dynamics, but I wanted to provide a common frame to what we will be discussing. And I also think I spoke for much longer than I should have, as we have three phenomenal speakers, and I want to leave to them as much time as possible. So without further ado, let me introduce our three speakers, and then we're going to hear from them. First, in order, we're going to have Hugo Micheron, who's a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University's Institute for Transregional Studies, and the author of an excellent book, Le Jihadisme Français, published this year by Gallimard. Then we're going to have Professor Bernard Haykel, Professor of Near Eastern Studies and Director of the Institute for Transregional Study of Contemporary Middle East, also at Princeton University. And finally, Hannah Stewart, who's the Director of Research at the Counter-Extremism Group and previously Head of Research at the UK government's Independent Commission on Countering Extremism. So the way we're going to structure this is that we're going to have initial remarks by each of the three speakers for some 10 minutes, and then we're going to move into a conversation among the four of us. Throughout this, please write your questions for any of us. Write your comments. We're going to try to address as many as possible as the conversation progresses and at the end. So without further ado, let me move to Hugo. And what I would like him to discuss is really what has been going on in France. Hugo, you've done some really great research on the connections between violent and non-violent Islamism in France. You speak of the Islamist ecosystem, which is a very interesting concept. So I would like you to address these matters, but also talk about what the debate in France has been, particularly over the last few weeks. Hugo, please.
Much, Lorenzo. Thank you for your kind words. I'm very honored to be part of that great panels. I would like to first, if you allow me, to frame what was my first research question when it comes to European jihadism, which was how come an ideology that was framed as, under its as a contemporary movement in Afghanistan during the 80s, during a very specific context, which was after the invasion of Afghanistan by USSR and Soviet troops, how this ideology, moved from this context in the Cold War to the peripheries of the great European and Arab cities, how this happened, and this, of course, there is no, it's not a simple questions and there is no simple answer to that. But I guess that one way to understand this is to first put it simply. I mean, jihadism didn't come out of a vacuum, was not produced out of thin air. It happened in a context and it spread toward the Euro-Mediterranean region. And this, this mechanism of the spread of this ideology went through like basic canals, namely human beings, militants who were first fighters in Afghanistan, then, recycled themselves into other countries, such as the Algerian civil war of the 1990s, such as the Bosnian conflict of the early 1990s after the explosion of Yugoslavia, such as the Chechen conflict at the end of the 1990s. And by this token, some of these militants actually ended up at some point in Europe. And this is the first thing we need to understand is like jihadism came through, activists who actually ended up at some point for some reason in Europe. And therefore, I think we're talking about, a universal movement, a movement that at least took a global dimension in the past 20 years, especially after 9/11, but it has a European pattern. By saying so, what I want to stress is that there is no such thing as a French exception when it comes to jihadism. There is a European, and to be even more precise, there is a West European pattern when it comes to jihadism, but this has to be understood in a more global context, which what we call global jihadism. Therefore, what happened when these first militants actually ended up in Europe? First, we have to understand that what they are doing is basic religious activism. It's a militant movement. Therefore, if we're able to understand what's a political militant movement, we're able to understand what's a religious political movement. And to this extent, I think, again, using very simple tools to describe it is a way to sort of trying to understand the specificity, but also the most common aspect of jihadism. And therefore, my second question after that was why in 2015, when ISIS reached its acme in Syria and Iraq, why there were people, European citizens who joined ISIS massively from certain areas and not from others. Why, there were 20 people joining ISIS from Lunel and almost none from Marseille, which is French second biggest city, where there is allegedly several thousand, hundreds thousand of inhabitants from Muslim descent. How come, in Belgium, there were more people joining ISIS from the richest part of Anvers and not from the poorest part of French-speaking Belgium? Why? There is this sort of geography that was revealing by people who joined in ISIS that was not overlapping neatly with the the map of social and economic discrimination. And this, I think it's a very important thing, is like there is a specific map of European jihadism. It has its own specificity, it has its own geography. And therefore, looking back in time, going back to the 1990s, what we see is that these activists, this first jihadi, we came out of the Algerian conflict, of the Afghan conflict, of the Bosnian conflict, actually they decided at some point to get involved in certain areas and not in others. And what is the factor that pushed them into these is most of the time the presence of other Islamist movements. And just like a politician that will choose to campaign in certain areas because he looked at the electoral map and understood that in this county he will receive more votes for his program than in this other. Well, actually, it's quite of the same when it comes to jihadist militants who decided at some point to get involved in some Muslim environment where they already perceived, there were some Muslim Brothers movements, there were some Tablighi movements, and from the late 1990s and early 2000s onwards, where there were Salafi preachers already. So that is, first, it's this religious dynamic we need to take into account. By saying so, I'm not saying we should reduce the success or unsuccess of jihadism to the religious aspect. I'm just saying we need absolutely to take this into account in order to understand the specific geography. Second, when they reach certain areas and they try and the success in organizing themselves, we need to understand this as, it always starts with small cells. I take the example of, for instance, Molenbeek, which became the place where the 13 November attack in Paris were organized in Brussels, but also the 22 March 2016 attack in Brussels, where all these cells, can be traced back to a few individuals who were there and implemented themselves in Molenbeek in the late 1990s. So how these small circles, at some point spread and recruit and, develop their network at the scale of a small, at a very local scale, but to an extent that actually get bigger and bigger. And this, again, we see there is a common pattern in all European countries, but also actually that fits a pattern that was, what we noticed in Peshawar, Afghanistan in the 1980s, which is like they organized basic militant activities. They became social workers. They, will set up a non-for-profit organization. They will build up religious school. They will develop, their reach into social club or sports club. And, by doing so, they are able, just like, for instance, in Toulouse, French fourth biggest town in the southwest of France, where there were hardly a dozen of them present in Toulouse in the early 2000s. And yet, a decade later, there is 200 of them. And among them, Mohamed Merah, one of the attackers of the 2012 attacks, and second, most of the Toulouse guys would join ISIS 2 years afterwards. So my whole point is to say, in order to understand current dynamics within, European jihadism, first, we need to address it as a militant movement and as collective dynamics, which we actually, most of the time, fell short to address because we consider jihadism as an individual pathway toward radicalization. And I think actually it's really like not understanding this sort of global collective dynamic. Second, we absolutely need to take into consideration ideology because, again, jihadism is a movement that was, built up that relates to a specific culture, a specific understanding of religious values. And therefore, if we're not taking into consideration these references, then we are unable to understand what's the meaning behind an attack. And last but not least, I think we should pay attention to how jihadism works between two attacks, because most of the time we perceive jihadism with an equal sign with an attack or mass murders, and actually it's not it. I mean, an attack is the byproduct of jihadism, not the cause of it. And therefore, we need absolutely to understand what's jihadi activism, in period where we actually do not have attacks, and therefore we will understand the current mutation of European jihadism since the fall of ISIS, because there is this timing, when ISIS reaches Acme in 2015, they launched a terror campaign in Europe. Now ISIS has been dismantled as, an organization that holds the territories in the Levant, yet jihadism as an ideology, is still there. Its ideological territory actually may have increased since 2015 in Europe. And therefore, we need to understand the ideological, political, and religious reconfiguration happening right now in Europe since 2018. And again, I think we're pretty far from it when we just look at attacks and reduce this to marginalized people who just have are either crazy or are a very bad understanding of Islamism, because it's actually in this sort of black box we need to enter in order to explain the phenomenon quite broadly.
Excellent. And with Swiss precision, 10 minutes exactly. I think if I get it correctly, you obviously described a phenomenon in which jihadism is a byproduct of, it's a collective effort. It's not the process of an individual. And I think in many cases there's been this idea of focusing just on the individual, almost with psychological approach, which is obviously not completely wrong in itself, but it's obviously not the only key to reading the phenomenon. And I think if I also understand correctly, it's been one of the approaches through which one of the lenses through which French authorities have been looking at jihadism, is the idea that there exists sort of a larger movement that creates sort of a fertile environment for radical individuals to radicalize and carry out attacks. But there's sort of that's the tip of the iceberg of a larger phenomenon. So this is sort of the conversations happening in France. Let me move to Bernard. And recently you and Hugo have written a very good piece where you looked at the American conversation, or at least the American reaction in some quarters, mostly in the media, about what has been happening in France, the reaction to jihadist attacks, the rhetoric of Macron. Am I wrong in seeing this giant gap between not just France, continental Europe at least, and the US? And if so, can you explain it? Why is it?
Thank you. Thank you, Lorenzo, for the invitation. And I'd like to also thank my fellow panelists, as well as your staff at GW and the program on extremism, which is really producing very excellent work. So you're right. Hugo and I actually published two pieces, one in Le Monde and one in on Persuasion, which is a website, about how the recent jihadi attacks have been covered by the US media, in particular by both what one would call a liberal leftist media, the New York Times, Washington Post, Vice, and also right-wing media, Breitbart and Fox News. And what we noticed was that the polarization within the United States is in fact affecting how these events have been covered. So, very, very kind of in very kind of broad brushstrokes, the liberal leftist media essentially was unwilling to describe these events as jihadi attacks, essentially put the blame on the French government for the attacks. So it was a blaming the victim phenomenon. And the right-wing media, on the other hand, basically pursued the line that these jihadi attacks encapsulate what Islam is all about, that basically jihadism is Islam. And in both narratives, both the kind of leftist liberal narrative, where the victims are Muslims and the perpetrators are the evil Western states, through this, in the case of France, because they have this rigid understanding of secularism, as well as the right-wing narrative, which equates violence with Islam. In both instances, you have actually a confirmation of the jihadist narrative itself. So it was strange for us, or at least for me, who witnessed the 9/11 attacks in New York, to see that the American media on both sides was essentially repeating and parroting jihadist views in different ways. So what explains this? I think there are several reasons for it. One is the polarization that I mentioned. The other is that in the United States, right now, we're going through a phase where everything on the left is seen through the prism of race. And I think Muslims in Europe are seen as people who are racialized and are seen as the equivalent of Blacks in America. And so therefore, they're victims. And so it's this imposition of an American filter on French and European politics, which says something about the kind of arrogance and the imperial kind of vision that Americans have, where they can superimpose their own analytical grid of analysis, onto other countries. And the same holds true, by the way, for the right, where they impose their own view of what they want to pursue in terms of the Muslim ban and so on, and the anti-Islamic policies onto Europe. So there's that phenomenon. The other is that, and I think this is shared with some Europeans, especially amongst the left, which is that there's an inability and unwillingness to attribute agency to Muslims. That Muslims are sort of structurally embedded in structures in which they are just victims, and these structures are strip them of agency. So one corollary of this view, this kind of very Marxist view of things, is that since Muslims don't have agency, their ideology, what they think, doesn't really matter, right? So there's a deliberate sort of blindness to jihadism as a culture, and to Islamism, which is not Islam, which is it's kind of an ideological form of Islam, an inability and unwillingness to understand it in its own terms, which is why you often get amongst leftists that jihadists are sort of ignorant, backward, uneducated people. They can't possibly have a sophisticated worldview. They can't have a culture. I sensed some of that myself in an article that I wrote with a professor at Yale called Robin Cresswell. We wrote an article on jihadi poetry for the New Yorker. And the point of the article was basically to say that jihadism is a culture. It's a particular and distinctive culture, and it's a sophisticated culture. You don't have to be sophisticated to partake in it and to enjoy it and to reproduce it, but it is kind of a sophisticated culture that appeals to it's a projection of what authentic Islam in the 7th century is. It involves poetry, it involves performance. And what was interesting at the time of writing the piece was that the New Yorker editors were very reticent. In fact, in the end, I applaud them for allowing the article to be published, but they were very reticent to attributing culture to jihadism, because the preference is to think of jihadis as these two-dimensional cartoon-like characters who are just evil. It's sort of a Dr. Evil kind of person, rather than someone who is a human being who has a view of the world and has a culture like all humans do. So I do think that the problem in America, it has, some of the problems in understanding Islamism and jihadism are shared. And you see this especially among both the right wing and the left wing on both sides of the Atlantic. So namely, you don't want to attribute agency to Muslims and to jihadis in particular, and you also want to strip them of culture. The other aspect of the American phenomenon is that I think because the attacks happened around an American election, there was a deliberate attempt to play down the Islamist aspects of the attacks by the New York Times, for instance. And my suspicion is that the reason for that was because they didn't want to offend Muslims, basically, by in any way associating these attacks with Islam. And so I think there was also kind of a cynical calculation again, whether with the New York Times, but also with the right wing, who wanted to associate these attacks with Islam in order to get more supporters, sort of, for President Trump in the election. So the dynamics are quite complicated. What's particularly sad for me is that 20 years, we're about to, in about less than a year, we're going to be at the 20th anniversary of 9/11. That in America, we still are unable to call a spade, at least in the press, when it comes to jihadism. And when it comes to Islamism, you either have to adopt a sort of an apologetic or attitude, or to try to say that really this has absolutely nothing to do with the religion, and I understand that impulse, or you have to vilify the religion itself by and that's what the right does, to associate and make jihadism the equal of Islam. And I think what's sad about that is that we haven't gotten beyond, we haven't gotten beyond a cartoonish, a very simplistic reading of this phenomenon. And I think the willful, the misunderstanding and misrepresentation of this phenomenon is willful. And it's to do with American politics in particular, and that's sad, especially if it then gets translated into policy, because policymakers are cherry picking what they want to hear from the media in terms of how to understand and how to think about these movements and how to contain them. I think I probably have gone over my 10 minutes. Thank you.
No, perfect as well. And I think these are very interesting points. The one about sort of cultural arrogance from an American point of view in trying to use American frames to understand non-American phenomena, the using Muslims as political pawns, both from the left and the right, I think was a very, very valid point. It seems to me, and maybe I'll get a quick answer for you, Bernard, before turning to Hannah. It seems to me that in some degree we've gone back in the States, that arguably the debate was a bit better 10 years ago. I think if I look at it just from a media point of view, let's keep the politicians aside, but most mainstream media had slightly more nuanced visions, maybe around 2005, 2006, 2008. And the last decade has been sort of bad for the media. Do you agree with this?
I do, and I think it's because of the polarization in American society, actually. I mean, I think that it's a symptom of the polarization in American society, and perhaps the fragmentation of the media landscape and these little bubbles that want to just hear and reproduce the same language and have their own views confirmed all the time. I agree. Although I have to say, and I have absolutely nothing to do with the Wall Street Journal. I've never published in the Wall Street Journal. I still find it to have held a line, on this, and to have maintained a standard that otherwise has been lost by other publications.
Excellent. Well, Hannah, the UK. Where does the UK stand in all this? Is the UK closer to Europe, or was there an Anglo-Saxon approach to Islamism? I think these are good questions for you.
Yeah, thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you too to the Programme on Extremism for hosting me and this valuable discussion. Yeah, in terms of the UK, in a nutshell on Islamism, I'd say we sit somewhere in the middle of America and continental Europe, I guess, as ever. But more specifically, to think about your question, I'd like to look at 3 areas. So first, where the UK sits in respect of its media and political discourse, which I think to some degree does mirror that of the US. I don't think our lens is as race obsessed perhaps as the US. I think we also think of it through the lens of religion and hate and discrimination. Secondly, I'm going to touch on what's being said by mainstream Islamist organizations in the UK, which definitely mirrors that of French Islamists and of certain Muslim leaders globally in condemning President Macron as guilty of Islamophobia. And third, I'd like to touch on what the UK has said and done in terms of policy on Islamism, And I think it's here perhaps where we are closest to France and the continent in terms of how we identify the issue, both as a social challenge as well as a security issue. So first, the British media. I guess you could say it's been a mixed bag. Earlier this month, the Financial Times, normally a very trusted newspaper in Britain, was forced to remove an opinion piece about French Muslims because it contained factual inaccuracies. The article misquoted President Macron, substituting Islamic separatism for Islamist separatism, a conflation which is, of course, a gift to Islamists. The piece went on to accuse Macron of stigmatizing French Muslims for electoral purposes and of fostering a climate of fear towards them. What's interesting, though, is that the same paper also reported on the ground much more of the reality of what the separatism that he talked about could look like, describing how some French teachers feel scared, for example, of showing films with, one of them was quoted as saying they felt scared of showing a film with a nude scene because there'd be shouting and real aggression, and the kids would say it's not allowed. So there was a bit of balance there, but others have come close to characterizing France as the provocateur. In an editorial in The Guardian, in the UK's left-leaning paper, The Guardian, they warned that Mr. Macron must not allow his anti-extremism policies to be derailed by psychopathic ideology, as if it was him who had that ideology. And I think what's striking for me is that this is a far cry from where the UK papers were at the time of the Charlie Hebdo attack 5 years ago. Then the press was united in outrage. So the front page headlines read "Attack on Freedom" in the Times, "War on Freedom" in the Daily Mail, and "Assault on Democracy" in the Guardian. These papers did also acknowledge various tensions in France. They talked about France's colonial past and the challenges of secularism, but not at the expense of identifying who the victim was. And I think that's the shift we've seen in the last 5 years. Shamefully for us Brits as well, our Prime Minister and our government has said nothing. There's been nothing from the leader of the opposition or the shadow foreign secretary. In France, I saw that some of the teaching unions led the way in mourning Samuel Paty, but here in the UK, our largest teaching union issued a tweet that just said solidarity with our sister union on this sad day, and that's really all the support that Britain had to offer to its ally. Secondly, what's being said by mainstream Islamists in the UK? Well, I'd say there's definitely lots of anger and there's genuine upset. But if you look at the output of the various Islamist groups and individuals, if you look at their social media, videos and podcasts, it's full of condemnation of France. And a common theme is to present political Islam or Islamism and Islam, the religion, as one and the same. And so an attack on one is an attack on the other. Some British Islamists have characterized the situation of Muslims in France to that of Jews in Nazi Germany, so making a comparison with state-sponsored genocide. A popular Islamist news site published an article that said, "The current actions of the French state in removing the rule of law and resorting to collective targeting and punishment of the Muslim community is reminiscent of the actions of Jacobin and the Vichy state authoritarianism. It will only lead to more injustice, alienation and violence by French Muslims and a rise in fascist and racist hate and violence among non-Muslims." I think there was, in conclusion, and I guess you could almost see this as a sort of proto call for arms, he said, "Sadly, if French history is anything to go by, we can predict which way they will go." Other Islamists went further. I've seen a video message with English subtitles from Hizb ut-Tahrir that used highly emotive language to encourage acts of violence as a religious obligation in defense of Islam. This video had an image of Charlie Hebdo with the subtitles, "Who will answer this cry? Islam is abused, Islam is slaughtered." And then later there was a direct call for people who've got military experience to fight against the enemies of Islam. And that included Charlie Hebdo and President Macron. So we see among UK Islamists calls for boycotting French goods, protests at the French embassy, and various joint statements condemning what they call recurrent insults towards the Prophet and the French government's violent crackdown on Muslim citizens, bits of which I think you could say echo some of the press coverage in the US. I think for me, I worry that this kind of content can't be having a healthy impact on the people that are consuming it. And the vitriol in some of the comments on these social media posts and articles are some of the most extreme that I've seen at any time. So commentators are writing things like, every Islamophobe must be beheaded. Or one very kind of conspiratorial comment I saw was, the killing of the teacher is pre-planned by the French government to defame the fastest growing religion in its country. So I think, you know, the CVE sector or PVE sector, whatever we want to call it, we've talked a lot about the impact of COVID on extremism and radicalization, but I'm not sure we've fully understood the kind of potentially radicalizing impact of these sorts of Islamist responses to the current situation in France. And lastly, I'll just say a few words about British policy, because I think here, this is where we are much closer to France and the continent on Islamism, notwithstanding our own sort of very different political sociologies. It's not, I guess it's not always been that way. We've not always seen Islamism similarly. So the men responsible for 7/7 in 2005 all grew up in Britain. And so suddenly for us, Islamism wasn't just a foreign threat. There was a lot of soul searching about how this could have happened. And the government developed a preventing violent extremism program, now known as PREVENT, that focused on political Islam. And the aim was to prevent British Muslims from supporting violent ideologies. But even from the beginning, the government and the police partnered with both Salafi and Islamist groups, believing that they could be powerful allies in the fight against Al-Qaeda, like a firewall, I guess, as it were. And too often in those days, funding went to Islamist groups, to Salafi groups and sectarian groups, and public institutions gave platforms to hate preachers. So for critics in Britain, this was like working with a far-right nationalist party to defeat fascism. And so under the leadership of David Cameron, we effectively had a kind of volte-face. He famously gave famously for us Brits, I guess, gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2011. He criticized state multiculturalism. He set out a kind of alternative, I guess, more active muscular liberalism to respond to Islamism, to radicalization, causes of terrorism. This was followed by a number of kind of changes to policy. So a promise that, in theory, that we would no longer work or fund with organizations that didn't share our values. Then there was an attempt, I guess, to write this so-called muscular liberalism into policy with our a counter-extremism strategy published in 2015. This is where we really did emphasize the need to tackle non-violent Islamism, not just because of its, I guess, is it being seen as a threat to national security, but also because of the damage it can do to society. Things like promoting hatred and division and encouraging segregation. So in that strategy too, the government understood that it didn't have all the answers. It didn't really understand the issues, and it committed itself to kind of developing knowledge on the way that Islamism can manifest. And so commissioned a variety of reviews on integration, on funding of Islamist groups, and on Islamist entryism. There was also a high-profile review of the Muslim Brotherhood that concluded that aspects of its ideology and tactics were not always contrary to our values. So you can see, I think, in the ways that I've outlined how the developments mirror the conversation that's been happening in France in the last 2 or 3 years. I'd say, in fact, many of the policies, even some of the more controversial ones outlined by President Macron, or something similar to them, has been outlined in the UK. But I think here's the rub, really. Many of these policies are far easier to announce in a speech than they are to implement in practice. And in reality, the UK counter-extremism policy has not matched its rhetoric. And there are many reasons for this. In some cases, it was probably the right thing to do. It probably wasn't legally or morally right to do some of the things we announced. In other cases, I think we've possibly been too timid. But I think mostly it's because tackling what Macron called Islamist separatism is really hard. And it requires a robust articulation of who we are and our values. It requires that we don't give up on the public space. We fight for it and we protect our institutions. And I think while it does require that we critically examine our policies for unintended harm, above all, we must do that without ceding control of the discourse on how we talk about Islam and Islamism to Islamists.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. Appreciate it. We're getting quite a few questions, so why don't I go for like another round, quick round of questions. Let's start again from the top. Let's start with Hugo. And well, I think it's probably would be useful if you could a bit kind of switching gears, but talk a bit about some of the ideas that Macron has been putting forward. I think there's been in a US environment, or in general outside of France, quite a bit of confusion. I think we've heard things are definitely not true, like the idea that some very prominent journalists in the US tweeted about that one of the ideas that Macron proposed was assigning a number to Muslim children in a French school system to track them, things that clearly not true. But if you can sort of break it down, and of course it's a complicated set of ideas and rules that he has proposed, just sort of the general framework that the French government is considering.
Yes, absolutely. Let me first say that what Professor Haykel and Hannah Stra just mentioned and commented about the debates in the US and in the United Kingdom is very important, because jihadists and Islamists as a whole are well aware of this. They are perfectly comfortable with the narrative that presents, Muslim as, by essence, victims of Western societies. And so it's not only us commenting like a phenomenon in the wrong way. It's also at some point like giving them some extra bullets to help their communication. And we know that communication in terms of jihadism is half of the job, So like, for instance, so many of the articles that were mentioned have been tweeted and shared by Islamist movement all across Europe, and I think that we need to understand like the political campaign that is putting on the blame on France, coming and, partly instrumentalized by countries such as Turkey or other Islamist movements in the Muslim world, backed in Bangladesh, Pakistan, or in Qatar. We have to bear in mind that it's also part of a narrative that is built around, the French situation right now, because it aims at enable any forms of discussion around the root cause of jihadism. So that's something that we need to bear in mind in the, while trying to understand the phenomenon as well, because now it starts to play a political role as well. So to answer shortly to your question, and thank you for asking this, I think that what is happening right now with the French authority in tackling the issues, like there is a change of paradigm. There is a change in the approach. Insofar, the French government was looking at jihadism through the lens of radicalization. So it was again, a sort of an individual sort of dimension, focus on the phenomenon. It was like why someone gets radicalized, and this was sort of short-sighted, because at the end of the day, it didn't explain, why there is 100-fold more jihadi in Europe that there was, 20 years ago. And therefore, looking at this, they started to understand that there was, ecosystem, where, activists were structuring schools and institutions actually that were at some point using some, religious interpretation to spread a narrative, to spread an ideology that was at some point creating an environment into which jihadists could recruit easily. And this is not like only Salafism, it's not only Islamism, it's a combination of socioeconomic marginalization, political marginalization, and religious, activism. And therefore, that's the change of locus. You need to understand what is happening into this environment. And jihadists that I've met in prison, for instance, they have a word for this. They call this, the engine of preaching. And therefore, like the change in locus is to actually try to stop this engine from working and from diverting French Muslim from, like a general pass into, the French citizenship to become at some point radicalized Islamists. And I think that it is a dynamic that is not only occurring in France, but actually all across the world and all across Western Europe. So what is happening in France should not be just like, perceived as, a bold French move, but also as, an initiative that should be discussed also in other European and democratic system in the Western world.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think indeed, all the attention has been on France since the attacks, but there's a few other countries that are equally, if not in some cases even more interested in the topic. I mean, Austria immediately comes to mind as a country. I mean, what some of the things that Macron has been saying and doing over the last year, Chancellor Kurz has been in Austria has been saying and doing for the last 4 or 5 years. And I think there's other countries, like to some degree the Netherlands or Denmark, that are very much following this line of thinking. So I would say there's not obviously a European agreement on this. There's different paces, different intensity in each country, but definitely it's not just France being an isolated case there. Let me go back to Bernard. I have a few questions for you. One has to do with and I'm going to throw a curveball at you, but it's the issue of foreign influence in the US, and whether this kind of debate that we have in the States is to some degree skewed because of the tangible investments that certain foreign countries and foreign groups have made in placing the right people and to be sort of the opinion makers. And of course, that's not an entirely American dynamic. You have it in a lot of countries, but arguably, of course, Washington is the capital of the Western world. So that's the place where you want to, of course, influence the debate as much as possible. Ben, I'm going to hate myself even more for asking this question, but it's necessary to ask at this time. If we ever talked about the US being not interested in the topic, what do you think? Of course, all the talk is about the new administration and with the new appointments. Very early to say, but just considering the names that have been announced, where do you see US policy in this? We're transcending just the domestic side. Obviously, we're more interested in the Middle East. What is your first gut reaction to some of the appointments made, Secretary of State and a few other key positions? Where do you think US policy on Islamism will go? I know a lot of people in the Middle East would be very interested in that in particular. So 2 questions for you.
Yeah, as far as foreign influence in the United States, I don't really see it. I mean, America is a very, very big place with lots of different centers, universities, think tanks, etc. I mean, what I see happening is that in the Arab and Muslim world, you have at the moment, I mean, very crudely again, 2 axes when it comes to Islamism. You have a petrostate like Qatar, which is funding all kinds of newspapers, magazines, online sites, and so on, in coordination with Turkey, where all the Muslim Brotherhood is essentially decamped and moved to Turkey, and where you have a massive media production, Islamist media production out of Turkey. So you have that, and Iran sort of fits into this Islamist camp, broadly speaking, although it has its own orientation, which is much more Shia and Khomeinist. But broadly, you have an Islamist camp that includes Iran, Turkey, and Qatar, and that is spending a tremendous amount of money, especially Qatari money. And I think what's happened is that they've found allies with a lot of European and American leftists, who basically don't want to think of Islamism as a culture, but rather want to think of Islamism as a problem of class or of race. And so there's a meeting of minds, or at least of interest, or confluence of interests there. And we see this in the publications that and where these people publish, and you can go to Jazeera and see who are the Westerners publishing on Al Jazeera, and you'll know right away that nexus of interest. Now, as far as your second question, oh, by the way, the other camp in the Middle East, which I forgot to mention, is the camp that's anti-Islamist, and that's led by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt. And that camp is vehemently, I mean, they're just viciously going after Islamists, imprisoning them, targeting them, etc. I mean, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, for instance, was part of that effort of the anti-Islamist camp. So that's the other axis, and they also have their favorites around the world, and they're promoting as much as they can people to support the anti-Islamist agenda that they're pushing. Now, as far as the United States is concerned, and the new appointments of the Biden administration, I'm actually very positive about Anthony Blinken and about Jake Sullivan. I think that these are people who are basically realists. I mean, they're internationalists. They believe in in multilateralism and international institutions. But when it comes to Islamism, they're hard-nosed, I think, especially when it comes to jihadism as well. You have to remember that President Obama was someone who not just led the attack that ended up with the killing of Osama bin Laden, but he had no reluctance to use special forces and drones in the war against the jihadis. I mean, he killed as many people, I think, amongst the jihadis as Trump. In fact, there's probably a competition between them as to who killed more jihadis, certainly in Trump's mind. But I don't think of people like Sullivan and Blinken as softies when it comes to this issue. And in particular, with the case of Tony Blinken, who I think spent a lot of his youth in France and is a graduate of a French high school and who speaks fluent French, he will be acutely sensitive to this debate in Europe.
Excellent, thank you. Hannah, two questions for you. One comes from the audience, and it's a broader question about secularism and sort of different systems. I think that it's a very long question, but the gist of it, if I do it justice by summarizing, is that to some degree radicalization is the sort of reaction to very rigid secularism in France, while we see less radicalization in a country like the US, because of course it has a very different system, much more tolerant to religion in general. How do you see it as a Brit? Different system? Can you provide the British experience, or in general? You can answer in general. I mean, the second question is very specific to what your work has been until. You had a very interesting experience in the British government as head of research for a very interesting entity, which probably needs to be a bit explained to a non-British audience, but trying to provide framework on extremism. So if you can summarize that experience, which I think obviously a lot of governments throughout the world have looked at and potentially try to replicate. So if you can very briefly explain it.
Sure. I know we don't have long. I guess so. To the audience question, I guess I'm very wary of anything that starts with, well, XYZ country has done this and they've got attacks. They've been attacked. We didn't do that and we haven't been attacked. Therefore, this is what you shouldn't do, because I think you just have to look across Europe in all sorts of different ways, whether it's about how secularism, sort of what the kind of social contract is in terms of religion and state involvement, or whether it's what your kind of government's foreign policy is, whether it's hawkish, whether you supported in the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, where you stood in solidarity with Charlie Hebdo or not. Any of these things you can see examples from both sides where people still face a challenge of what Macron would call Islamist separatism within those countries. And sadly, those countries have all seen some kind of jihadist attack. So I think, you know, the US has, Britain has, and France has, Germany, Belgium. These are all countries with very different settlements in terms of how we think about religion and the role of religion in our society, how we think about it in terms of our schooling. I mean, I think most people would say that the system in the UK is perhaps more similar to the US than the kind of quite very strong kind of dedication to secularism that you see that you see in France. But still, the narrative put forward by Islamists in Britain, and I heard this a lot at the Commission, was this idea of secular extremism. And so, you know, and that forms of religious extremism were a reaction to that. So if, for example, we in Britain weren't cracking down on schools, religious schools so much, then we wouldn't see this reaction. So I just think you have to be very wary of these sorts of ways of identifying the root causes. In terms of the Commission, my experience at the Commission, wow, I mean, so I was there for about 18 months. It's the government's independent commission countering extremism. I think really it came into existence after the wave of attacks in 2017 because the government had announced, as I sort of touched on before, a whole range of ideas, bills, some of which were quite authoritarian, and hadn't really been able to get much traction. And I think this was a case of outsourcing the policy thinking to an independent entity to see what they could do, what they could provide. And it was a fascinating experience because it was the only time that I've worked within government rather than outside throwing rocks, as think tanks often do. And I think it was a real reminder to me that there are some really dedicated people in the civil service doing hard jobs every day, but that a lot of the time people are moved around from department quite frequently, and they arrive in the counter-extremism unit, or they're doing some sort of counter-radicalization work, and often they haven't been properly trained, and so they are very wary of talking about Islamism and very wary of being called racist or Islamophobic. And I think if there was sort of one lesson that I could take from the Commission, it's the number of sort of 2-hour-long meetings that I sat in about extremism where the term Islamism wasn't even spoken once, because that's the really hard bit. And so I think that's one of the reasons perhaps that we haven't made as much progress in the kind of so-called battle of ideas here in the UK.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you, Hannah. We're generally very strict when it comes to time, and I want to be loyal to that concept. So I think we're going to close it there, and I apologize to those who have sent questions. But top of the hour, we wrap it up. I'm sure everybody would virtually join me in thanking our 3 great speakers today. I think we had a very interesting conversation. We touched on a lot of topics, each of which could have gone on for a long time and deserved its own analysis. But really, thank you very much to all 3 of you for joining us today. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you very much.